the head of public diplomacy at the Embassy of Ireland here in Berlin. And with my colleague Elias Ben-Mana, we present various different speakers every month to talk about their experiences of making it in Germany, making it in Berlin. This month, we are very pleased to have Andy Costello, also known as Andrew Costello, with us today to talk about his experiences here in Berlin, how he came here, why he came here, how he stayed much longer than he expected, and how he is developing his businesses, what he's doing here in Germany, what he's doing in Berlin, and to give us some tips on how to make it in Berlin, which is the series title of this speaking events, Making It in Germany, Making It in Berlin. So Andy, you're very, very welcome. We're delighted that you could join us. People are very interested to hear what you have to say, to hear about your story. So please, without further ado, the floor is yours, and we are very much looking forward to hearing your story. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Everyone, welcome to my living room. I wish we could be doing this in the bar, but unfortunately, with the time that it is. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm from Dublin. I grew up in a place called Sutton. I've been in Berlin since 2007. I moved out of Dublin just before the financial crisis really took hold. I got over here in November, and I think within about 2 or 3 months, things started to crumble a little bit at home. But I'd spent years working around in bars and restaurants. That was where most of my background experience came in. I was working in kitchens from a fairly young age, mostly just washing pots, chopping vegetables, doing all the jobs that need to get done that nobody ever sees. I moved over to Vancouver in 2005, 2006. And worked around a couple of kitchens there. I was mostly concentrating on kitchen work at that time. And I had one big experience there. I was working in a very successful Italian restaurant. And I remember talking to the head chef one day, and he hadn't had a day off in 6 months. This is a guy who's in his late 50s. And then I realized what it took to really make it in a kitchen, and realized that this job was definitely not for me. So it was after that I started working in the bar. I started working in a craft beer place, which is probably ahead of its time now at this point, and then moved back to Dublin in 2006. So when I first came over to Berlin in 2007, there was a lot of Irish people moving over at that point. There was a lot of Irish moved over here in the 90s, moved over, and there's a big building boom over here. So there seemed to be a lot of people who had been here for a long time, and a lot of people who had just arrived over. My first job over here was working in an Irish pub down the center of the city in Hackersmarkt, and ended up staying there for, I think it was nearly 5 years. It was an incredibly busy place, and it was a really good introduction to the city. It was probably not the finest drinks or food I'd ever seen, but the money that the place took in was just an absolute monster. It was an absolute machine of a place. It was a super hard job, but I learned a huge amount while working there. So I ended up staying there for 5 years, left in 2013, I think I left there. I worked around a couple of different cocktail bars in the city, just super fun. The city where we moved over was, it seems a little bit of a different place now. The clubbing scene at that time was huge. Obviously it's still pretty big now, but it was a super fun city to live in, and it was super cheap. Coming over from Dublin, which was an incredibly expensive city to live in, really expensive to go out, to eat out, to drink out. Berlin was the total opposite. Berlin, you can eat out and drink out for absolutely nothing. And that was an incredibly fun thing to indulge in those couple of early years. But we first started coming up with the idea for Salt and Bone, I would say around 2013, we started putting plans together. We started talking about it. We could, like a lot of people starting a business, we saw a niche in the market. We really wanted to open up an establishment that was as focused on the food and the atmosphere and the drinks as a kind of like in our head, that was the golden triangle. We wanted somewhere that was going to be really, really fun, that wasn't just about going out for food. It wasn't just about filling up your belly with something delicious. It was about going out and enjoying the whole experience. We really believed that when you're going out for food, it's not really just about going out for food. It's about going out to really enjoy yourself and have a good time. And certainly our favorite restaurants at the time were not places that had the best food. They were the places where we had the most amount of fun. And that's what we really wanted to recreate in the city. So we didn't really see anything like that. We had places that we loved for food, places that we loved for drinks, places that we loved for the atmosphere. And we didn't see a reason why you couldn't have something that was like really all those three things together. So we started looking for a location, I think like late 2013, early 2014. And that was really tricky. That's when we realized we really didn't have a clue what we were doing. So I was doing this with my girlfriend, Becky. She's from Dublin as well, and she's been working in bars and restaurants for a long, long time. Both of us had probably our first jobs around 15, 16 in the industry. So we thought we knew exactly what we were doing. And there were certain elements of the business that we definitely did. We definitely knew how to run a busy bar or a busy restaurant in terms of how an actual night will run. But what we realized very quickly was there's a whole other business elements that we didn't have a breeze about. So we spent about a year researching the location, just constantly going to view different places, weighing up the pros and cons. And then eventually we found a little spot, which is actually just around the corner from where we lived. Let me see if I can just get the photo of that up there. So, perfect. Cool. So if anybody knows the neighborhood Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin, it's during the 90s here, it was the big party zone. It's when all the nightclubs opened up in Berlin, or not when all the nightclubs opened up, but after the wall came down, essentially, Prenzlauer Berg became the area where all the nightclubs were. There was a lot of abandoned buildings. It's the old East. It was really the party area. And this little place opened up in the early 90s. It was a kind of somewhere between a live music venue, a disco bar, and they also sold soup from the kitchen. Absolutely bizarre, but it was it suited our needs perfectly. But by the time we took over it, it was pretty run down, but it was just absolutely full of character. I've got a few photographs of when we took it. So this is the first day when we just got the keys, and then we realized pretty quickly it was going to be an incredible amount of work. Our budget at the time was below zero. We had very little money to be able to flip this, and we really didn't have an idea because we didn't have experience doing this before. So in our idea was we were going to do everything ourselves. So there was myself, a good friend of mine, my partner Becky, an old boss of Becky's was helping us out as well. And the idea was we just strip it back to zero and then build it back up again. So as you can see, it's not the prettiest looking bar in the world, and we wanted to have a nice restaurant there. Does it the old as the old bar there, because it was more of a nightclub. They didn't really have seats at the bar. It was just they didn't have draft beer. It was a little bit grimy, to say the least. I think it had its heyday in the 90s and the early 20s, but by the time that we got in there, it was a little rough, to say the least. Sec, give me 2 seconds. Oh, flipping down. Sorry, this is just freezing up on me here. Okay, so can't get the next photo up, of course. But either way, yeah, it took us 2 months to build out the whole place. We were expecting to get open in 2 months, but it took us 2 months just to strip it back to nothing. And that was literally ripping out the bar, ripping out the back area, ripping out the toilets, ripping out the kitchen. We had to take it back to absolute zero. It was an absolute nightmare. We thought we'd get open in 2 months, but it took us 2 months just to get it back to nothing. So by the time we got back to that point, we started putting our concept together of what we were actually going to open up there. And sorry, I'm just still trying to get the next photo up here. I apologize about this. Okay, I'm just gonna have to leave that. Yeah, so after 2 months of stripping the whole place out, dealing with problem after problem after problem, it was hard to imagine ourselves as people who actually ran restaurants and not people who were builders. But alas, we got there in the end. We spent another 2 months. Becky's mom had come over and did all the interior design for us. We really wanted somewhere that looked quite old and that had been around there for a long time, but we had to take that from a blank canvas. I think she did an absolutely fantastic job to get it there. By the time we came to opening, we were, I would say, burnt out to pieces. We had spent 4 months working every day, every night. It was a really, really hardcore build, and we learned a huge amount. It was a real insight into how you were actually going to run the business going forward. Every day we were going into the building site and we'd find a new problem that we had never seen before. We came in one day and the wooden floor was sticking up out of the ground. We thought we'd just cut it back a little bit and the whole thing would flop down. And then we cut it back, didn't flop down, cut it back a little bit further, didn't flop down. So then we pulled up a few floorboards and we realized that all the floor underneath, all the soundproofing underneath the floorboards had all completely collapsed. So then we had to pull up the whole floor. And then we realized that all the concrete under that had collapsed as well. And we had to pull all that up. And we looked at a hole in the floor for about a month, not being able to afford builders to come in and fix it, but not being able to move the project forward until the whole thing was fixed. And that just absolutely just totally slowed us down. Eventually we talked to a couple of people. We got some bags of cement in, and myself and John just laid like 2 tons of concrete over the course of 24 hours, and we got the floor done. And then we got it leveled off by, we finally had to get some professionals in, but it was just another nightmare. But eventually we got to the point where we were nearly there. But at the same time, we were also running out of money. And we didn't realize that this is such a big problem. It's actually something that happens with restaurants a lot of the time. You get to 90% built, run out of money, and then the place actually never gets open. So we really didn't want this to happen. So we set a date for opening, and we just said we're opening at this date no matter what. We had all the health and safety guys from the council came in, and they give us a list of stuff to do. And we had 3 days to do it. It was a really interesting 3 days. We slept there every night. We stayed up nearly 24 hours on the last night. But they came in, we were due to open at 9 o'clock in the morning, due to open that evening, but the council guys were in that morning. Up until that point, we didn't even have a morsel of food in the place. Because it had just been a building site, we hadn't been allowed to actually bring any food in. So we couldn't do any preparation, we couldn't do any menu testing, we couldn't do anything. It was not the ideal way to open a restaurant, because we had also been hammering away on social media, trying to build up hype for the place, trying to get people excited. We've been talking the place up in other bars in the area to anybody who was walking by. We had managed to generate a decent bit of hype, but we hadn't even cooked anything up to this point. So we got the council in on the morning. It was the Friday morning, the Friday the 13th, which yeah, wasn't ideal, wasn't the dream. The next day was Valentine's Day, so we didn't want to do that day either. So we said, okay, let's just go Friday the 13th. But the council came in, everything was fine. We got all our last stamps of approval. And then we had to write a menu. At this point, we didn't even have a menu yet. We were fully booked for 2 sittings that night, which means we had all the tables booked twice out of the idea that this was going to be a cool place to be, even though nobody had seen a menu at that point. It was wild, absolutely wild. So we went to the wholesalers, figured out what we could afford, built out the whole kitchen. We didn't even have salt and pepper at that point. And we literally spent every single last penny we had, went to the taxi coming back from the wholesalers. The night we were opening, we had change in the wallet so people could pay. That was it. But we literally spent every last penny. It's a terrible, terrible way to open up a business. People generally advise when you're opening up a restaurant that you should have about 6 months worth of fixed costs at least to keep you going. And we didn't have a penny to do anything the next day. It was just absolutely wild. We didn't have a clue what we were doing, but we were full of enthusiasm. We were going to make it work. So the first night came, we were packed, everything worked. We wrote one menu out on a chalkboard, and the only option was a platter for 2, and people loved it. There was a good friend of ours who was working in the kitchen. His name is Sean. I had worked with them in Dublin. Becky had worked with them in Dublin. The 3 of us had been good friends for a long time. And he had moved over to open up the restaurant with us. He was actually from Berlin, but we knew him from Dublin. But he moved back to Berlin to open up the place with us and just did a mind-blowingly good job. Just absolutely killed it. We didn't have much to go on, but we knew that if we could make the right atmosphere and the food tasted good, that everything else would just fall into place. So yeah, the first night came around, we were jammers, we were full, everybody loved it. They loved the drinks, they loved the food, everybody paid their bills. And then with that money, we were able to afford to buy food for the next day. And then we did the same thing the next day. Went to the wholesalers in the morning. We had a bit of extra money, obviously, this time from selling out. And then we just did the same thing again, wrote up a whole fresh menu for the next day, absolutely killed it. And then we closed for a couple of days. And that was really how the ball got rolling with us. We had an idea of what we wanted the food to be, but we also knew we didn't want to be stuck in a certain little box. We wanted to be able to move and develop as the concept moved forward. So like with the drinks concept, we just wanted to we wanted to use a lot of local spirits. We wanted to have something that was like really true to the neighborhood. So we had a short cocktail menu, and then we also had a lot of local breweries on. This is at a time, this is way before craft beer really got started in Berlin. There was maybe one other restaurant selling craft beer at that point, and maybe about two or three bars had started stocking it. But it's nothing like the boom that is there now. Nothing like it has been for the last 2 or 3 years. So people, it was very new to people, very, very new. And we just wanted to do something that was a little bit different to everybody else. Sorry, 2 seconds. Of course, the delivery just came. Sorry about that. He'll be here in 2 seconds. Yeah, but we wanted to do something that was really different. We wanted to really push the boat out with the drinks. We wanted to push the boat out with the food. And then we really started to pull the concept together once we had opened. We knew once we opened that we can kind of fine tune everything. Once the ball was rolling, we could kind of add on to things, make things a little bit nicer. We knew the basic infrastructure for the restaurant was there when we had opened. We could cook, we could make drinks, we could make the place look nice, but there was a lot of corners that we knew weren't as polished as we actually wanted them to be. But this is all stuff that you can figure out as you go along. And once you've got an income and once you've got some cash rolling, then it just makes it a little bit easier. But for the 4 months when we were building, we were just paying out every single day. It was absolutely, you're just watching your money going down the whole time, not sure if you're going to be able to get there. Sorry, I just have to take in a package, 2 seconds.
Might be food for tomorrow's menu. Let's see.
Classic Murphy's Law there. Somebody was supposed to turn up an hour ago, turns up now. Yeah, we knew once we got started, it would be easier to iron out some of the creases, because one thing that is really tricky when you're building a place out, it's tough to imagine yourself not being a builder, because that's all you're doing for 4 months. You're solving problems like, how am I going to get the air conditioning to work? How am I going to get all this equipment into the kitchen? We had a health and safety guy turn up one day and went, oh, your changing room is not big enough. And we had to take 25% of the space out of our kitchen to build a changing room. It was, and for those guys, it was nothing. But for us, it was like, okay, there's another 5,000 gone. And the whole build is like that. And then by the time you get open, you've almost forgotten about why you did this in the first place. So we spent the first 2 months after being open just keeping our concept kind of tight. We were doing, what we were known for was meat and beer. Those are our main two things. We had a pretty, like, it was probably around the time Prenzlauer Berg was starting to get a lot more vegan and vegetarian than it is now. But you could see the winds of change, and we were doing something just the total opposite of that. So it was a scary time for that kind of concept, but it definitely paid off. But we got through our we survived our first year, and we just had an absolutely mind-blowingly good team. I think that's for any business that I've ever worked in, for any bar that I've ever worked in, that is everything. And that was certainly everything to us. Our opening team, pretty much everybody stayed for the first year. It grew a little bit bigger, but in an industry where 6 months is the average, to keep everybody for a year was mind-blowing. For going into year 2, it was, I think some of the infrastructural problems we had started to show a little bit more. It started getting a little bit quieter. And then I think at the start, you have this momentum that builds up. Everybody's excited about you. Everybody wants to go there. And then that starts laying off after a while. And then you require more. It's just all about building a regular base. We were super lucky around this point. We started getting a little bit quiet. And then out of nowhere, we became #1 on TripAdvisor for restaurants in Berlin. And that just, we went from 2 Fridays in a row where we literally served about 10 people over the whole night to being #1 on TripAdvisor, and the whole thing just exploded. We went from 0 to having a queue of people out the door and down the street every night of the week. It was absolutely mind-blowing. So the thing with TripAdvisor is when you've got very little viewings or very little ratings, it doesn't take much to bring you up really, really high. And so every rating that we were getting was 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. So it gave this idea that when people were coming in, they were expecting, like, the only other people who were in that top line were like Michelin star restaurants and places actually doing legitimately fancy food, whereas we were doing more like a gastro-pub kind of feel. It was like really fancy pub food. Like, it was great, but it wasn't what people were expecting when you get put in a position like that. But that literally got us over our first really, really bad hump. Because I think bars is the same, certainly with restaurants. Nobody ever wants to go into an empty bar. Nobody wants to go to a quiet restaurant. People just walk by. And when you're full, everybody wants to go in there. So it nearly, the TripAdvisor thing for us just acted as like a rent-a-crowd. People saw that it was busy, so they wanted to go in there all the time. And once you've got that momentum, it's a little bit easier to keep it up. So we stayed. First year was really solid. Second year was like good. Third year was where pretty much our whole team changed. Everything just went a little bit sideways for us. We had built up an awesome team, and And then one by one, after, like, people have been there for 2-3 years, people started to come away from the job, which is pretty typical in our job, that people come in this industry, learn whatever they can, and then move on somewhere else. Because when you're such a small establishment, you don't have this big hierarchy where people can move up the ladder and up the ladder. With a small restaurant, you come in, you learn everything you can, and then people move on after about 2 years or so. So after about 3 years, we had a full team change, and the next team that came in was just very different to the team we had built before. It didn't synchronize so well. It was also around this time Becky got pregnant and we had a child. So that was something we hadn't planned, and it was definitely, it made running a restaurant a little trickier. We worked nights. We worked every night. Like, I'd say probably 6 nights a week, like 100-hour weeks was pretty normal, but it was something we really loved doing, something we wanted to do. But then once a child comes into the mix, everything just changes, absolutely everything. We had to take a step back. We had to figure out, what are we doing? But within the week that Dylan was born, our head chef quit. His 2 chefs below him had quit because of him. So the week he was born, I had to go working in the kitchen. I'd been working in the bar for the couple of years previous to that, and then had to jump into the kitchen, and it was just a clusterfuck, to say the least. It was just trying to juggle having a newborn child, working in a kitchen that you hadn't worked in for quite a while. It was not a dream situation. So I continued doing that for, oh God, it's all such a blur now, but I'd say we kept that up for a couple of months. I was working in the kitchen every day, coming home, helping Becky in the evening. Not a particularly enjoyable time in the restaurant. We just kept the thing going. We simplified the concept a little bit. It was also at the time we couldn't find chefs to work in the kitchen. Trying to find chefs to do our level of food was just really, really, really tricky. It was not, it was no fun. And then I remember one day I came to work and it was just me and one other guy working in the kitchen, and he turned up to work with a broken finger. I was already burnt out to pieces at this point. It was like, okay, do you know what? We're done. It was a Sunday, I remember, and we were supposed to be doing a Sunday roast that day, and had the whole restaurant booked out, and I just closed the whole place, rang up everybody, cancelled everything, closed the restaurant for probably about 2 weeks then, two or 3 weeks, and got to hang out with my son consistently for the first time really since he was born. And it was just absolutely lovely. Shut everything down, turned my phone off for a couple of weeks, had to essentially let most of the staff go apart from one staff member, and just essentially let the whole thing die. It was a really, on one side, happy to get out of there, but also super grim. You spend 3 years building something up from nothing, and then all of a sudden the whole deck of cards just collapses. It was like a really tricky time, but I took a couple of weeks off, and then at some point it was like, okay, let's get this built back up again. So we reopened just as a bar initially, and we got all the cogs moving. And then after about 5 or 6 weeks, we had so many people coming in looking for food that we were like, okay, let's just do something super simple. Let's not have this super fancy concept where we need really fancy chefs coming in to execute this food. So we started off just doing burgers then. Just the burger had always done well anytime we had one on the menu. So we thought, let's just do the burgers. And I went back into the kitchen. And then after a couple of weeks, we started hiring some more staff. And then after about a year, we were probably busier than we had been before we closed. Like, it took a long time to build up the momentum again after being closed. People just weren't that quick to come back. You get a lot of momentum when you first open up. When you close and reopen, it's a lot trickier. And we're definitely seeing that now during COVID times. So it's the same thing trying to build up again. But we opened back up. We're running for about a year, just doing the burger thing. And it's probably better than we had ever done before. It was like we're probably about 4 years deep at this point. And simplifying the concept, simplifying our working hours. We had to change everything, obviously having a child, that me and Becky couldn't both work nights anymore. So that changed our home situation a lot. But we found ways to work around it. And actually we stopped working 100-hour weeks. We stripped it back to probably like 40 hours a week, which was huge for us, but it actually gave us a lot more time to work on the business rather than in the business. I think that's probably one of the biggest pitfalls for anyone that I know that's ever started a restaurant or a bar, is you spend all of your time deep inside the business, and you're serving people every night, you're making sure everything's running smoothly, but there's nobody there to actually make sure that the whole thing is working from an outside perspective. We realized after about the third year that not having somebody full-time looking after the admin, looking after the accounts, looking after the marketing side of things, these are all the things that actually keep a place successful. Of course, you need good food, good service, good drinks. But if none of the admin side makes sense, then nothing makes sense, because you're not going to be able to pay your wages at some point. It was something that it literally took us 3 years to learn. And taking a step back from it and looking at it from an outside perspective was the best thing that could have ever happened with it. So we went into year 4 pretty solid. And then year 5, it really blew up for us. Year 5 was going absolutely fantastic. It was probably the best margins and best time, or first time we'd ever taken a real profit out of the place. The place is actually ticking along super nice. And then COVID came. Just as we got everything sorted, COVID came out of nowhere. We had the best November we ever had. We had the best December we'd have ever had. And then in January, when things are usually really quiet, we were still super busy in January, and was like, okay, this is great. This is how it's supposed to be going. And then February happened, and there was this little flu thing that was on the other side of the world that we were kind of keeping an eye on, but not really too sure. And then we could just see by mid-February what was happening. We could see that tourism was slowing down. And we were definitely luckier than a lot of restaurants, that we're very much like, we have a neighborhood vibe in our place. We deal with mostly regulars, mostly people who live in the area. We get a lot of tourists on the weekend. And with definitely when there's big conventions in town, we'll get a big influx of people. But in general, we're a very neighborhoody kind of place. But we could really see the numbers were starting to drop in February. And we could see on the weekends, which we'd get less regulars on the weekend, but a lot of tourists on the weekend. And we could just see that we were quite like doing okay Monday to Thursday. But then Friday, Saturday, Sunday was just like tragic, really, really tragic. And then it started getting really tight in, I think it was March. In March, we had some days we were serving like 5-10 people. And I think that was the scariest time during COVID of the whole, maybe not the whole thing, but at that point we were really bleeding out, because it's one thing when you're actually closed, it's not so bad because you've got your fixed costs, but you don't have as many running costs when you're closed, and it's a lot easier to calculate everything. But when you're paying full wages out every single night, and the nature of food is we don't sell it, it goes dead. That was the worst time, because we made everything fresh in the restaurant. Stuff doesn't last a huge amount of time. It requires a huge amount of turnover to actually make the whole thing make sense. So, but when you're sitting there just looking at everything dying every night, when you're looking at all your staff who are getting paid an hourly wage, not taking in any money any night, that was horrific. That was really, really horrific. So we had a meeting just before, oh God, when was it? It was just before St. Patrick's Day, I think it was. we just decided we were going to have to shut the whole thing down until this blew over. In our head, it was like, let's just shut it down for a couple of weeks. Let's see what happens with this flu thing. I think Italy might have been kind of closed down at that point, and that's what we were basing a lot of our judgments on. Okay, that's happening there. This is happening here. Maybe in about 2 weeks that might happen with us. And then during the meeting, we were explaining this to the staff. Everybody was pretty shocked. Everybody was upset. Nobody, we couldn't tell anybody what was going to happen. And when you have a lot of people who rely on you, like, we know if we don't pay people, they're not going to be able to pay their rent, pay their beer money, pay everything else. And that was a really scary time because we didn't know how people were going to get paid at that point. The government hadn't released much details of what now is like the Kurzarbeit system, in which people's wages are taken care of when we're quiet. At that point, we didn't have a clue. So we had to shut down, and it was really going into it went into the great unknown for us. It was super scary, but it was also, from a personal point of view, it was also, okay, well, at least we're closed now. There was certainty at that point. There wasn't waiting for the unknown. And that was last March. And I'm trying to think how long I think we closed completely for about 3 or 4 weeks. And then we had enough cash to pay people's wages, to pay our rent and stuff at that point. We had done all right over Christmas. So we were okay for a little while. But after about a month of paying out bills, the nature of the restaurant businesses, you're paying a lot of bills from last month, which is totally fine as long as you've got a consistent level of income. But when all of a sudden that stops one day, you've still got your bills from last month coming in. So that still has to get paid. So we spent about 4 weeks with no income, paying out everything. And then we decided the government was allowing everybody to run a takeaway business. So we started takeaway in March, I think it was. No, sorry, about mid-April or so, we started doing takeaway. And that was a slow start, but lucky enough, our main product, which is burgers at the time, is a really good takeaway thing. It's a really good takeaway item. And also the weather last year was absolutely fantastic. So we had a lot of people coming up and getting burgers, getting a few beers, sitting down in the park. And it was a weirdly exciting time. Everybody was shit scared, but still kind of excited because they didn't know what was going on. And we dealt with a lot of customers who had been who lived by themselves and hadn't socialized much, hadn't been in the office for a long time, hadn't seen people. And when we reopened, we had a lot of people coming into us who hadn't seen people in a long time. And it was really nice to be able to be that point of contact where they'd come in and have a chat, have a beer while they're waiting for their food, and then leave. And then what we found started happening was somebody would order food for 6. Then they'd turn up at 5:30, drink a couple of beers waiting for their food, get their food at 6, drink another couple of beers before they go. And it was like, it really gave people just that little touch back of a little touch of normality, a little time to sort of get outside of their house and see, and just see some other people. So we kept that running, and we built a whole new business model at that point, because we knew there was certain elements of our kitchen that didn't really suit being a takeaway business. We knew we had to change how our whole staffing system worked. We had to all of a sudden have packaging, because we'd always been a restaurant, and a restaurant and a takeaway business are, as much as they both sell food, they both sell a similar product, they're run completely differently. One was like, when we had our own delivery bikes at that point as well, which was, again, a whole logistical nightmare. It was something that we had zero experience in, but we knew at the time we didn't want to rely on a third-party company. So the third-party companies here, if you order a burger and say it costs €10, that delivery company will take €3.50 for themselves. They'll take about 30%, and then you pay tax on the money that they give you. So you end up with very little money when you're actually working with these third-party companies. So we were doing our own delivery service at the time. But we did that for, I'd say maybe about 6 or 7 weeks or so. And that got to the point where it was doing really well. A lot of people were coming up, getting beers, sitting in the park, getting some burgers and sitting on the park. It was super, super nice. And then we had just developed a whole new takeaway menu. We had all our systems in place. We were going to have a bit of a relaunch of our takeaway concept. And then the government announced that we could reopen again. And that was literally the worst thing that could have happened to us. We had just built up this thing to be like this machine for like this McDonald's style-esque, being able to bang out burgers all day. And then they announced that we'd be able to open back up again. And we had to just go back and change everything again. It was horrific. So we were able to open back up inside, and any kind of government grants, that all just dried up really, really quickly. So it was really easy for us to be able to exist on less money when you were getting some support from the government. But once we opened back up, all that completely dried up. But then we opened back up with 30% of our capacity. So normally we would have, maybe during the summer, with outside and inside, we might be able to squeeze about 100 people into our place. And we were in a situation where we could fit 26 people in. But of course, your rent is still the same, your electricity is still the same, all your running costs are still the same, but yet you've only got really 25% of the possible takings that you would normally have. So it was a really tricky time once again, but we got through it. And then we started to figure things out. We started using the third-party company for delivering food. So those seats that we were missing, we were able to essentially sell to Walt. And then we got a bit of extra cash in through the third-party companies. That was kind of balanced things off again. And then November struck, and then they completely killed indoor dining. I think we closed an outdoor dining at that point as well. We had people sitting outside the restaurant right through October, because people were just too afraid to sit inside. So the outside was actually fine. And then in November, the whole thing just got totally capped off for us. It didn't make any sense to have any kind of dining. And we did takeaway for November. And then in December, we were looking at the numbers, and we were losing more staying open than we were being actually closed. So then in December, with the risk, we didn't essentially want to run out of money over Christmas. So we decided to shut the thing down in December, and we stayed closed for 2 months. And it was a nice Christmas in terms of, it was the first Christmas in maybe 5 or 6 years we hadn't worked every single day over. For the last like half a decade in Salt and Bone, we were an extremely busy place for Christmas parties, really busy on Christmas Eve. We always had a big party on what would be the Christmas, like the German Christmas Day on the 24th. But this is the first year in a long time we actually got to celebrate Christmas ourselves. So that side of things was lovely. Total fear over the restaurant, but there was, what we found to happen at this time, we had made so many pivots. We had turned around the business so many times. You kind of lose your fear after a while. You kind of just accept that you have no control over anything, and you just do your best with the cards that you're dealt. And we knew closing at Christmas or closing at the start of December was the best move to make. All our instincts were screaming out, going, this is a terrible idea to be open. There was also the huge thing of safety with the staff. We didn't know the full details of exactly what was going down, but we knew that if we were making our staff travel to come into work, that was essentially putting people in a little bit of danger. So then we closed down for 2 months, and we opened up in February. And we started doing takeaway, the same as we're doing now. But yeah, we've been doing okay since we opened back up. Like it's still nothing compared to actually running a normal restaurant. It's still not half as busy as we're used to or we'd like to. This industry is full of absolute adrenaline junkies who love it being extremely busy and working as hard as possible. And in this time, it's just all been about taking a step back and just kind of working at a much slower pace. So now we're super excited about, hopefully we might be opening back up in about 2 or 3 weeks just for outdoor dining, but it will be, I believe, baby steps towards getting back open indoors, which we probably won't happen until, I'm guessing, I don't know, maybe September, October. I can't see them letting us open until everybody's vaccinated, essentially. But I think we'll just have to see. But we've been incredibly lucky to have such a strong, supportive team that's allowed us to make quick judgment calls to allow us to stay open all this time. But we'll just have to see what's going to happen over the next couple of months. It's the great unknown for us. But yeah, that's where we're at now. I apologize if that was very rambly. I am a little bit annoyed the photographs didn't work, but I'm sure they'll work as soon as this call ends. But yeah, I think I can leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was comprehensive. It wasn't rambling at all. It was very interesting. And in terms of making it in Berlin and the theme and the topic of which we speak, your story is quite inspirational. I was taking inspiration from it. I was writing down notes here. I mean, you look at the holes in the floor, you kept going, you had the resolve to keep at it. You had just that sort of small change in your hand after the taxi rides home with all the food. Your story speaks of determination. And a couple of questions come to mind, one of which, and especially when we're talking about making it in Berlin, is you spoke about the inspectors coming and they came in the morning that you were supposed to open. And it struck me then, what was the planning permission situation in Germany and in Berlin specifically, when you said you had to rip out all of the floors and then reestablish, and then these inspectors came and said, change the changing room. What are the pitfalls there? Is it transparent? Is it a quagmire? Is it difficult? As somebody who came from Ireland via Vancouver, did you find it a hassle, or was it clear, or how was your experience in that?
That side of things was an absolute nightmare, because not only are you dealing with, because we weren't builders, we're dealing something in a different language as well. So that's just like an added layer of complexity there. So my German was okay at best. My partner Becky, she had fluent German, but it was even just a different level of German. When you're used to working in hospitality, like my German's quite good. If I'm to talk about food, I talk about food and drink all day in German. To talk about plumbing and electrics and that side of things in German, it's just a whole different ball game. It's a whole different set of vocab that you need. But what we found was the toughest bit was we talk to the health and safety guys, and they would say one thing, and then we'd have to go and visit the Bauamt, which is the building planning permission guys. They would say a different thing. You would go and talk to then the restaurant association, and they would give you another bit of information. So there was very little to actually link everything up. So a lot of it for us was essentially just winging it and just hoping that either somebody wouldn't notice, wouldn't remember what they had said the time before. But in comparison to doing stuff in Ireland, it's very different. It's black and white. Like for instance, the alcohol license, which in Ireland can cost, I believe, anything up to 150,000 euros, cost us 50 euros to license our name to it. And so we could sell alcohol for 24 hours a day. So from that side of things, there's certain elements that are a lot easier here, but then there's certain elements of, certainly with planning permission, that was a lot more difficult. And that was just a case of we just figured it out as we went along. We got in touch with other friends of ours who owned bars and restaurants and asked them what they did in certain situations. One thing that we've learned since it was we joined an organization here called the Hoga just before the whole Corona thing happened, and that was a huge amount of information for us. All of a sudden, then we were able to talk to lawyers who were able to give us proper legal advice. which we never had when we were doing it ourselves. But a lot of it was just learning by doing and just figuring it out as it went along.
Your talk today will help others. If I had known then what I know now, type of thing is applied to the Hoga straight away. But it sounds like you have a book in yourself, actually. Yes. Now I'm going to open the floor out to others who may have questions. And if you have a question, turn on your camera or wave your hand so we can see you, or physically, not physically, but digitally raise your hand in the app. We have Carol. You just come on screen there. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. It was really, really interesting, Andy. I was curious as to how you got your name, because it's quite unique, and the restaurant, I mean, and also what kind of outdoor space do you have? Is it on the pavement, or are you lucky enough to have a little garden there?
Hi, Carol. Thanks very much for the question.
You're welcome.
The name was the name was one of the trickier things that we had to put when we were opening up the restaurant, because we knew with food items and with drink items, you can swap them in and swap them out. But we knew with the name, it was like, okay, this just has to stick. And one of the things that we really wanted to get to the basis of was, and going back to the basics of cooking, was very much about salt and seasoning. And with salt, kind of like salt and bone, is like all about, that's it for us. That's what food is really about. That's the starting point, stocks and sauces. It was all about getting back to that kind of basic idea of where all our food is coming from. And we went through a lot of names. We knew we wanted a double barrel name, something that kind of would easily roll off the tongue. And we were literally we spent night after night, most likely drinking probably a few beers, just spouting out different names. And then when we said Salt and Bone, we all laughed. And then later on in that night, we went back to it and went, do you know what? That's still the name that was ringing in my head. And then we talked to a lot of friends of ours. What do you think of this name? And everybody loved it. And so we decided to go with it. And then in terms of outside, we're literally, we don't have a proper beer garden. We can take up like 1 meter and 1.2 meters out. And then the length of the restaurant, or the width of the restaurant, is 9 meters. So we have like 9 meters by 1.2 meters. And in normal times, we could probably fit maybe about 40 people out there. But now with the Abstand, we have to have a gap of 1.5 meters between all our tables. So that really cuts down the amount of people that we can actually serve outside. So that's it makes it a little bit trickier in these times, trying to serve as many people as actually want to come into the restaurant. From time to time, what we'll usually do is, because we have to keep a gap big enough to fit a double stroller down the street. So there's enough of a gap to fit a double stroller, and then we can put more tables on the other side of the path, which we technically are not, like, legally we can't do it. So what we tend to do is we start doing it at the start of the year, and then at some point over the course of the summer, the Ordnungsamt will come along and go, that's not allowed. And some of the time that might be in May, some of the time that might be in August. We just essentially chance our arm with it every year, and we'll usually get a couple of months having a slightly bigger beer garden.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I stayed in that area about 2.5 years ago now. How close to you are you to the station? Because I stayed right across from the station, the U-Bahn station, in an apartment there.
Oh, we're only about a 5-minute walk, I'd say, from the station. If it's Eberswalder you're thinking of, we'd be about 5 minutes around the corner.
Yeah, good. I look forward to going there again.
Yeah, no,
and visiting
sure.
you.
We're on a super quiet street. There's literally very little else on the street. We've got a park at one end and a very busy street on the other. And so we require a lot of social media and word of mouth to actually get people in the door, because there's very little footfall actually happens on the street.
Thank you, Carol. Dara, you have your hand up. Please unmute, and where you go.
Thank you. How you doing, Andy? Good to see you.
All right, how's tricks?
Not too bad, thanks. when you opened up, you mentioned you were very, very meat centric. You had to change that, and you opened up more to vegetarian options and stuff. Did you? Was that well received? And how much more vegetarian have you become? Has the level from meat vegetarian options?
Oh, for sure, for sure. It's tough to judge by our menu now, because our menu now is probably not a good representation of what we kind of strive to do.
Right.
But we opened up, and initially we were like 100% meat.
Yeah.
We don't need much veggie stuff. There's enough vegetarian restaurants around. And then we learned very, very quickly that it's not the problem of just having meat. It's just, it lowers down the amount of people who will come in. Mm-hmm. So we used to get a lot of group bookings in. So you'd have people who are coming in 5 or 6 people to a group. And the problem is, if you've got very limited options, there's a decent chance at least one person in that group is vegetarian. Yeah. And so we started expanding our options, and then we essentially just allowed more people to come in. And especially, we were really focused on having a really good drinks program as well. So we didn't want people to not be able to come in and have a good time because they weren't able to get something to eat that suited their dietary requirements. And if I'm to be completely honest, I would imagine in maybe the next year's time, if things go back to normal in January, I would imagine probably in a year's time, we'll easily be 50-50 meat vegetarian. And if we're still there in another 5 years' time, I would imagine it will probably be 90% vegetarian.
Oh, wow.
It's the area is changing a lot. I think people's view towards meat is changing a lot. And one thing that we've seen is we try and move towards a lot more sustainable farms and sustainable meat. Yeah. It's hugely expensive. And at the start, when we first opened, we did come in at a much higher price point, but being a neighborhood place, it just puts a lot of people off. And we wanted to be the kind of place that people could come multiple times a week. But if you're to have a menu of really insanely high quality meat, only sourced from the best places, you're just going to price a lot of people in your neighborhood out. So having more vegetarian options gives people it lets people come in at an easier price point than just getting expensive meat dishes. So I could definitely see in the next, if we're still there in 5-10 years, we'll probably be mostly vegetarian at that point. Okay. Which is hard. It's crazy my head saying that, but yeah, if the trends keep on going in that direction, we'd be crazy not to change with them.
Yeah. So you go from salt and bone to salt and stem.
It's just about changing with the times. I think we'd be crazy not to. And like, even I find myself, I eat a lot less meat than I used to. Yeah. I used to be eating burgers and ribs in there every single day, and then realized very quickly that diet kills you also really quickly. So it's you just have to move on. This is something that we were kind of unaware of maybe like 5-6 years ago, and now that it's been brought up, it's not even the health benefit, it's just more the sustainability of it. Yeah. And we want to be somewhere that's kind of at the forefront of that. So it's just about moving with the neighborhood, I suppose, is a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks a million. Enjoyed the talk.
Good to see you.
Best of luck, you too. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, Sarah. Patrick O'Reilly has a question. Patrick, if you'd like to unmute and come in there.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Andrew. That was really, really interesting to listen to. I'm always in awe of people who have the confidence to go out there and start a business like the way you described it. A terrifying story, but it's clearly come good. So congratulations. Just a couple of questions in relation to the pandemic. I mean, do you envision or do you see any other kind of long-term changes to dining experiences? I mean, do you think, are you expecting that the day will come where you will have the people in there packed to the rafters as you used to do, or have we changed things forever? Second question, a bit more out of naked self-interest. Do you still do deliveries? Because I'm within kind of touching distance of you, but I haven't made it yet. But I would have to it'd be handier if you delivered, let's put it that way. And thirdly, and going to Dara's last point, I'd like to trademark the idea of, if you go vegetarian, to kind of salt and boneless. But yeah, I'll leave you out. I imagine there's a whole range of things you could do with that. Thanks so much.
Do we see it going back to normal? No, not anytime soon. I think there's just going to be massive shifts with why people are going out. I think one thing that we've really seen is that as much as going out is about going out for food, as I think I mentioned before, one thing that we're really going to be doubling down on when we do open them back up is people are going out for an experience. People can cook at home now. People have been forced to cook at home a lot over the last while. And I know for me, like, okay, I come from a cooking background, but I think people really want to go out and have a good time. I see there being a bit of a shift away from super fancy fine dining, where it's all about the food, to people really going to a lot of places that are a bit more neighborhoodly, and people supporting their locals as well. One thing that we've really seen from talking to people who work in big chains compared to local restaurants is there's been a huge show of support over the last while, with people supporting their local places instead of going to big chains and big corporations. And then in terms of in the actual dining room, I honestly have no idea of what people's perception is going to be in a busy place. Right now, I really can't imagine us packing it out as we used to, which means we're going to have a huge shift in how we fill up the room. We used to create atmosphere in a way of people were like, we're not a big establishment. Everybody was always kind of packed in, and it was quite cozy. People would really pack into the bar. We're like one of the few places in the area you can actually come and have a full 3-course meal while sitting at the bar. And the idea now of people sitting shoulder to shoulder in the bar, I can't see it happening anytime soon. If it's in a dream scenario when everybody gets vaccinated and this thing maybe subsides a little bit, I would love to think that we will go back to the way that it was before, because that's something that I really enjoy. I think it's people really feed off the atmosphere like that. I don't know if you've ever sat and had dinner in an empty restaurant, but it's not a particularly enjoyable thing to do, no matter how good the food is. So I would really hope we can get back to that point, but I can't see it happening for at least another year or so. So what we found when we reopened during the summer last year, we had people who would not sit inside, no matter, even if they were the only people there, they would not sit inside. And we had other people who just didn't care. They would sit themselves down right beside people without even asking. We really saw a split of people who were extremely cautious about being around other people. And then you have this other 50% of people who just don't care. It was absolutely, the whole thing is just over their heads. They didn't understand what the big deal was about. And part of our job then is just trying to make the places comfortable for everybody. And unfortunately, as people have a few more drinks in the evening, it becomes a little bit tougher to control. But it's luckier for us because we're in a restaurant sitting where people are eating and don't tend to quite get as jolly as people would in a bar. But I think our job is just going to be trying to manage everybody's expectations as well as possible. I think in terms of delivery, yeah, we do delivery at the moment. You can get your food delivered through Wolt within 2 kilometers. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to start our own delivery service, moving away from the third-party companies. And I can't remember what your last question was. Oh, it was about the vegetarian thing. Yeah, we'll figure that thing out as it goes along. Right now, it's just about surviving tomorrow. One thing we learned really early on in this pandemic was trying to plan too far ahead was absolutely pointless. What we were really doing on a constant basis was adjusting everything as the weeks would go on. So instead of having one long-term plan, we would have an A, a B, and a C plan. And then as the weeks would go on, we would just adjust to go on like that. So I think in terms of what's going to happen over the next 5 years, we will just figure that out as long as we get out of this mess that we're in right now. Is that everything that you were wondering about? Perfect.
Okay. I think you've answered Patrick's there. So we also have a question from my colleague Elias Ben Mana, who helps me on the public diplomacy side. So Elias, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Andrew, for this insightful and also entertaining talk. And I have sort of like a straightforward question, and it relates to fusion food, because fusion food was all the rage a couple of years ago. And it could be that the very ultra trendy and ultra hip neighborhood of Prenzlauer Berg is already beyond that. But I was wondering whether you had any fusion food on your menu, especially now that you're an Irish person working here in Germany, and maybe you came up with some nice recipes that bring together Irish and German cuisine. Thank you.
So in terms of fusion food, our food has always been a mix of, I think, somewhere between kind of Irish and British and American food. But really what our menu has always been a representation of whoever the chef was in the kitchen and them working towards their strengths. So our first head chef, Sean, he was from Berlin, had Irish, his dad was Irish, mom was Danish, but he had worked in a lot of Japanese restaurants in Dublin. So our menu was very much just a representation of what his cooking experience was to that point. So we've never really set out to do fusion food as such, but it's always been, okay, well, we've got this kind of like American barbecue thing going on, but then we're using maybe the sauces that he would know from working in Japanese restaurants. So it's not something we necessarily set out to do as fusion, but something that just, it was like a happy accident, I suppose. And our menu and our concept has changed so much and evolved so much over the years that it's really just been like we had one guy we had one head chef who came from this real fine dining background, and we had a big French influence for a couple of years. And we had another guy who came from an Italian background, and then we had these little Italian twists that were coming in. So our thing has always been about just having really big flavors, hearty food, and just being super, super tasty. I think that's things that ring really well in our neighborhood. I don't think that sort of food would work as well in maybe a neighborhood that was a little bit more conservative than ours. We're lucky enough that in Prenzlauer Berg, people are really, really well traveled, are used to eating really, really big flavors, are always looking for spicy food, and that's something that suits us really, really well. I think fusion food will always exist because chefs have the tendency to move around a lot, and chefs always want to cook with what inspires them. So if you've been a chef who's been living in Mexico for 4 years, just because you moved to Germany doesn't mean you just want to cook schnitzel all day. So that's, I think that the food will always be evolving like this. Does that answer your question?
Perfect, thank you.
I have one question, Andy. It's in relation to the actual food and things you said are inspired. Do people come to you because you are Irish and Becky's Irish and say to you, I want some Irish food, I want the Irish beef, or I want the Irish eggs, or whatever it is? Or you said earlier you have that local feel. Do you have a dichotomy there, or is it just you stick with what you know, or how does it work for you?
So one thing when we were conceptualizing the restaurant, we really wanted to have to sort of bring in that atmosphere of what an Irish pub is in Ireland. That it's like not somewhere you'll necessarily go for the food, but somewhere that if you're having a few drinks, it's nice to have food there as well. But what we really didn't want to do at the start was be an Irish pub. And for no other reason than a lot of the Irish pubs in Berlin, and I'm sure it's the same over the rest of Germany, don't always have the expectations of having really good food and really good drinks. It's more just about having the crack and here's some food to go alongside it. And we didn't want to be thrown into a category of being an Irish pub. We wanted to be more like a pub that you might find in Ireland. So we really didn't have that association for when we first opened. Now as time has gone on, we've done some events kind of promoting we've always had like St. Patrick's Day has always been a really big day for us, but we've never really been seen as an Irish pub of sorts. Like a lot of people have said, it's like a really good pub that you might find in Ireland, but not necessarily like one of the big super pubs you might find in Charlottenburg or down in Hackeshamarkt or anything like that. But yeah, we've like Irish food I'd say Irish cuisine might not necessarily be something that a lot of people will come in looking for, but in terms of Irish products, it's definitely something we've had people coming in and going, have you got Irish fish here? Have you got Irish beef? Have you got any Irish beer? And like we recently just took on O'Hara's just before everything kind of went sideways there last year. And that was having a huge response from people. People really liked the fact that they could come and get like an Irish craft product, or supporting a small company that wasn't just Guinness and Diageo, which is generally, when people think of Irish beer, it's always Guinness. And it's a beautiful product, but for us, we wanted to have a stout on, but we also would much prefer supporting a smaller company. So when we were able to take O'Hara's on there last year, had a tremendous response from all of our customers. And we were looking at changing all of our whiskies to Irish whiskies as well. After building up the reputation of not being an Irish pub, we were then slowly starting to go back into this direction of going, okay, now that we have that reputation for giving out a really high quality service and high quality product, then we wanted to go back into more the Irish direction over the next couple of years. But then we just had COVID came along and kind of put a stop on that for the moment.
Yeah, put a cork on a few things, all right. That's true.
For sure.
Andy, I think people will be wanting to go back to work or wherever it is.
For sure.
But I'll just ask if anybody has any questions, could you just raise your hand now? Otherwise, we might call evening and afternoon and let people get away through the sleety, rainy Berlin or wherever you're calling us from. Sunshine is coming out a little bit now. But speaking of Irish beers and stouts, Andy, we're happy to say that we actually have some O'Hara's. We've a case for you that you should hopefully be able to use.
This was not a paid advertisement.
No, it is absolutely not a paid advertisement, but it is something that we're proud to be able to say is Irish and is doing well in Berlin, and you're a great exponent and promoter of it as well, where you are. And thank you for coming in and speaking to us today. It's been very, very interesting for a whole of reasons. And I have learned a lot today. The only thing that I have to say to you is your Scotch eggs are the best in Berlin. Please keep the Scotch eggs going. I'll be coming back for them. And I've yet to go back for the ribs and whatever else you have. So, Andy, thank you very, very much. And I think I speak for everybody when I say that you're a wonderful speaker. And it's a pity your images didn't work.
Oh,
it's great.
So I just kind of went sideways there at the start to talk my way out of it.
It's not quite so well advertising to get us to come. Your place looks lovely, and we'll be happy to go when it reopens again. Thank you very much.
Well, have a nice evening. Best of luck.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.